Should we stop Brexit, remain in the EU, and revoke Article 50?
Stop Brexit!
Well, it's a topic that has become trending, with a petition to revoke Article 50 reaching 2 million signatures. But is it the way out of this mess? I'll be looking at this from 3 angles. The impact it would have on the country as a whole, the impact on the Westminster bubble, and finally, the impact on the EU. Even if you don't agree with me, consider subscribing by the end of the video. The impact on the UK as a whole. So there's no doubting, people who voted to leave the EU and still believe the UK should leave the EU would be seriously upset should the UK not do that. And it all depends how the UK chose to remain on how they would react. A second referendum campaign might divide the nation further, but at least democratically justify remaining should the UK vote to remain, while revoking Article 50 outright would defy any democratic mandate this Prime Minister might have. In times of political anger, people tend to react either by silently protesting via an election, or taking to the streets to protest, striking from work, or even full-blown riots. There's no way of knowing how the public will react. Secondly, while all economic forecasts predict the UK will be worse off by leaving the EU than remaining, political instability and uncertainness might be created should the UK decide to remain. It's possible the political uncertainty could counterbalance any benefit the UK would get from staying within the single market and customs union. Finally, are the problems that leaving the EU never solved, such as knife crime, terrorism, the NHS, the trains, etc. And there will be a sense amongst the public that if the decision to leave the EU wasn't respected, then neither will the wants and needs of the British public in general. There's also the impact on the international community outside the EU to consider.
I'm surprised at how badly it's all gone from the standpoint of a negotiation. But I gave the Prime Minister my ideas on how to negotiate it, and I think you would have been successful. She didn't listen to that, and that's fine. I mean, she's got to do what she's got to do, but I think it could have been negotiated in a different manner, frankly.
Would betraying democracy lead to a breakdown in international relationships, or would keeping our market open to Europe reassure future investors? I think it would depend on the country. On the other hand, remaining in the EU would free up the government to be able to concentrate on those other issues I've just mentioned. There would be a sense that MPs would have to work harder to mitigate the loss of trust by the British public by introducing constitutional reform. There has been a number of issues raised since the UK voted to leave the EU which have shown that the UK itself is not fit to deliver democratic referendums. And those are the things MPs would be expected to change. For example, there was no written constitution outlining whether the Prime Minister or Parliament has more power. The first past the post system means that the third parties struggle to make an impact in the UK. The Fixed Terms Parliaments Act means that an unlikable Prime Minister can remain in office for 5 years. The House of Lords means unelected peers can potentially block a bill voted on in the House of Commons. Erskine May stops a bill passing any further, regardless of how much the public may or may not want it. England doesn't have its own devolved parliament, while the rest of the UK does, and there is no written rule about referendums and how much support they need to be enacted. All of these things are procedural and legal things that have been sidelined throughout the years to deal with more day-to-day things like the NHS. MPs will be expected to give more time to such things, but there's every chance they could run out of time by concentrating on more immediate matters, leaving the public disappointed and even angrier. Ultimately, our success inside the EU would depend on how the EU reacted and how functional the Westminster bubble really was. Westminster. Both the Labour Party and the Conservatives have been trying to take the UK out of the EU since 2016, so it's unlikely they would suddenly do the opposite, unless a second referendum was held. But if somehow a revocation of Article 50 occurred, it would mean the two main parties failed to deliver on their main manifesto pledges of 2017. The House of Commons would have failed, the civil service would have failed, and the damage to those institutions would likely make the country ungovernable unless a party managed to gain from remaining in the EU and managed to hold a significant majority in Parliament. 61% of Conservative voters and 35% of Labour voters voted to leave in reference to the 2015 Parliament, according to YouGov. But remaining could be spun as saving the country from the cliff edge of leaving the EU, and it all depends on the political situation at the time. Whether revoking Article 50 was agreed by Parliament by a huge majority or a slim one.
Over the years, I and many others have been very critical of many decisions taken by the EU, and I remain very critical of its shortcomings, from its lack of democratic accountability to the institutional pressures to deregulate or privatise public services. So, Europe needs to change, but that change can only come from working with our allies in the European Union to achieve it.
Exiting Brexit might also be incredibly time-consuming, perhaps more so than leaving, if a second referendum has to be agreed to give MPs the mandate to revoke Article 50. The time consumption for remaining might not counteract the losses in trying to figure out a way of leaving. Let's say there are some MPs who do their job for their salary and holidays, they're bad MPs. Then remaining in the EU isn't necessarily going to give those MPs what they wanted, because there'd be more time needed to come up with a second referendum question, and they're more likely to therefore disagree than agree. There's no majority in Parliament at the moment for a second referendum, and that's the only way to democratically remain in the EU. So the reality is, it's unlikely. But those MPs who have sat on remaining since 2016 can claim victory. And let's face it, there are more people who voted to remain in Parliament than those who voted to leave. So a new coalition of EU thinking can at least be formed. Having said that,
It definitely is worse if you're a woman, and it's worst of all if you're a coloured woman.
a Tory Remainer, an SNP Remainer,
Weak, weak, weak.
and a Labour Remainer
Currently, we're kind of, in the polls overall, we're kind of level pegging. We went
6 points behind.
You're behind, Diane.
Yeah, but we went into the last general election.
are very separate political viewpoints who all hate each other. This idea that they'll suddenly stop blaming each other and work together seems unlikely, especially since remaining in the EU ultimately takes the EU out of the political equation and leaves the country having to deal with everything else domestically. Take the EU out of the debate and you're left with more traditional UK politics. A Labour MP would not support austerity, an SNP MP wants Scottish independence, and Tory MPs do not support the pacifism of socialist Labour. It's difficult to see how any political party can either recover or reform from remaining in the EU. Even if a brand new party grows, it would still require MPs from the parties I've just mentioned to join. Some have suggested that it would push the right towards UKIP and the Brexit Party, and the left towards the Socialist Labour, and they would be the main parties in Parliament. But most MPs in Parliament are moderate, so where do they go? And there's no way the extreme right or left could keep the country happy and work together if it was required of them in a hung parliament.
They say you were called a fascist and a racist.
Well, the real danger is that today's our national conference, you're the BBC, your job is to be a public service broadcaster and to ask us what our policies are, what our aims are, and what the electoral difficulties are, but you don't appear to be very interested.
Lastly would be the impact on the mainstream media. The likes of the BBC and others have suffered majorly as a result of the EU referendum. The left blame the BBC for exposing the likes of Nigel Farage too much, giving leaving the EU too much of a platform, while the right accused them of Project Fear tactics to scare us into staying in the EU. Either way, the mainstream media have been implying that the UK will leave the EU since the vote. If the country decided to remain after all, will it feel lied to and therefore distrust the mainstream media forever, or will it recognise that the mainstream media ultimately doesn't have a crystal ball and cannot predict the future? I think it all depends on whether revoking Article 50 suddenly comes out of nowhere, or if a long process leads up to revoking Article 50. Either way, the desire for popcorn politics in media sales and ratings is likely to drive more political shocks in the coming years, and the media's desire to relish in all of that is only going to make people point fingers back towards the mainstream media even more, leaving large chunks of the population relying on new media that has the potential of disinformation that could lead to the next version of Brexit.
I've been wondering what that special place in hell looks like for those who promoted Brexit without even a sketch of a plan how to carry it safely.
The EU. It's difficult to imagine the UK once again sitting with EU leaders round the same table voting for EU budgets again. And that's the main reason why they don't want to extend Article 50 into European elections and beyond. They don't want a disgruntled member state vetoing everything the EU is trying to achieve. But at the same time, I'm sure they'd be delighted to have the UK contributing to its budgets and using its markets fully. Nobody knows if in the event of revoking Article 50, this entire Brexit saga will be met with reward from the EU or punishment. If it's punishment, the UK might not be able to retain the same custom membership that keeps us out of the Eurozone and Schengen area, and there might be a price to pay. If it's reward, then likely the UK will be granted the concessions that David Cameron tried to achieve before the EU referendum itself. But if the desire to leave the EU outright goes away, the UK will want to reform Europe from within. Reforms such as the European Human Rights Convention.
Well, let's talk about Article 8, which affects people who you want to remove from the country, but you can't remove from the country at the moment because they are going to court and saying, I have a right to family life, I have married this person, or I have got this child, and therefore whatever I've done as a convicted criminal in this country, you can't get rid of me. That's the essence of the trouble, yes?
The problem is that Article 8 is in the European Convention on Human Rights.
Yes.
Complying to the European Convention on Human Rights is still under the withdrawal agreement, by the way, because it still applies under the Good Friday Agreement.
And if you look at it in the Convention, there are two parts to it. The first part basically says you have a right to a private and family life. And the second part says that actually states, governments can qualify that right. Mm-hmm. This is not an absolute right. So in the interests of the economy or of controlling migration or of public order and those sorts of issues, the state has a right to qualify this right to a family life. Now, what's been happening up till now is we've seen cases going through our courts where people who are criminals, who we want to deport, have been able to stay in the UK because the courts have said, no, you have this right to a family life. And they haven't been qualifying it, even, I think, in the way that the European Convention enables them to do. And so what I'm going to do is actually set out the rules that say this is what Parliament, this is what the public believe, is how you balance the public interest against the individual interest.
The EU so far seems to have been able to survive a member state leaving the bloc. But should member states look towards creating a land border initiative that makes it easier to cross and trade across the EU borders while retaining immigration controls, then it's likely the entire EU as we know it could dismantle. It would certainly give power back to landlocked countries and remove the Irish border question. It all depends how well the EU can keep control of future financial collapses and future refugee and terrorism crises. But do you agree with me? Should we remain in the EU? Join in the debate below and subscribe.